I never doubted my father. I grew up listening to his words in Sunday sermons, believing every syllable as if they were unquestionable truths. He was more than just a religious leader in our small Texas town. He was a pillar, a role model, a man of integrity. To me, to my mother, to every family that filled the church pews every week, I was raised to be the perfect daughter. No parties, no short skirts, no questioning. My world had always been ruled by clear, strict guidelines, and I followed every single one. I thought that's what made me a good person. So when I got the chance to attend a university conference in New Orleans, my first instinct was to say no. My father always said big cities were dangerous, full of temptations. But my mother insisted. She said it would be a good experience for me. And maybe, deep down, I wanted to see a little bit of the world too. So I went. The conference was intense, packed with lectures on faith, morality, religious history, topics I knew inside and out. But on the last night, a classmate invited me to dinner at a well-known restaurant in town. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. It was just dinner, right? That's when everything fell apart. In the middle of the meal, between small talk and bites of food, my eyes wandered across the restaurant. And then I saw him, my father. My heart started pounding as my mind scrambled for a rational explanation. He never mentioned being in New Orleans. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was here on church business. But then, I saw he wasn't alone. Next, to him was a woman, dark-haired, beautiful, with a smile that felt far too familiar to be just an acquaintance, and two small children. I froze. I could only stare. My father was laughing, looking so at ease, so natural. I walked out of the restaurant without thinking. My legs carried me away on their own, as far as they could take me. My hands were shaking, my stomach twisted. The only thing I could think was, this can't be happening, but it was. I did something I never thought I would. I followed my own father. Guilt hit me instantly. This was wrong, wasn't it? Spying on someone sneaking around in the shadows. But what about him? The man who taught me about honesty, about truth, about loyalty? What about what he was doing? I stayed at a safe distance and watched as he got into a regular car. Nothing like the black sedan he drove back in Texas. He drove for about 15 minutes to a quiet suburban neighborhood. Then, he parked in front of a modest house, nothing like the big home we had in our town. And that's when it hit me. The kids got out of the car first, laughing, running toward the door. The woman followed right behind, carrying a bag. And him. He walked after them, smiling. They all went inside. My father had another house, another life, another family. My throat tightened, and I had to lean against a street lamp to keep from collapsing right then and there. Everything I believed in started to crumble inside me. I wanted to run up to that house, bang on the door, and scream, "Who the hell are you people?" But I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, staring at that house like I could absorb the truth just by looking at it. I spent the entire night digging. I needed proof. I needed to know just how deep this hole went, and the more I found, the worse it got. Thomas Harper, the beloved reverend of our town, was Thomas Whitmore in New Orleans. Businessman, married to Rachel Whitmore for almost 20 years, 2 young kids. No official ties to the town where I grew up, as if he was a completely different man. That night, I realized something terrifying. I had always seen my father as a beacon of morality, a man of unshakable principles. But staring at the evidence in front of me, I realized I didn't know him at all. Now I had to decide. Would I keep this filthy truth to myself and try to move on like nothing ever happened? Or would I confront the man who raised me and risk tearing my entire family apart? The problem was, deep down, I already knew the answer, and there was no turning back. Going home never felt so suffocating. Every detail of the town where I grew up, The clean streets, the identical houses, the friendly glances from people at church. It all seemed like a lie. I knew nothing had changed, but I had. During the Sunday service, I sat in the same pew as always, between my mom and the other devout wives who hung on every word of Reverend Harper. But this time, his voice didn't sound the same. Each sentence felt like a sharp blow to my chest. Every mention of honesty made me sick. And yet, there he was, standing tall in the pulpit, his face serene, his hands raised in false holiness. No one saw it. No one knew. But I knew. After the service, when the congregation had scattered, I found my father in the church office. I shut the door behind me. He smiled. "Lily, my girl, what a nice surprise." That's when I broke. I slammed everything I had. Onto the table, photos, records, messages, everything that proved he wasn't the man he pretended to be. Everything that proved my father was a traitor. His face crumbled. For a moment, I thought he'd deny it, that he'd try to convince me I had misunderstood. But he just sighed and rubbed his face, exhausted. And then, without hesitation, he said the words that would change my life forever. "I always knew you'd find out one day." The floor vanished, beneath my feet. He didn't try to justify himself, didn't beg for forgiveness. He just looked at me as if it were an inevitable burden, something that had to be revealed sooner or later. I asked why, how he could do this, how he could deceive so many people, how he could lie to me. He just replied, "Because I'm a man, Lily, and men fail." That was it. That was the big explanation. A part of me wanted to scream, wanted to break everything around me. But another part, the part that had grown up listening to this man as if he were a prophet, felt something worse than anger, contempt. I looked at him, and I no longer saw my father. I saw a small, weak man, full of empty excuses, and that's when I realized I wasn't trapped by his rules anymore. I left the church office without saying another word. Outside, the sun was shining, the congregation was chatting animatedly, and the kids were running around on the lawn. The world kept turning as if nothing had happened, as if I was still the same girl I had been before. But I wasn't. I drove aimlessly for a while. My heart was heavy, my mind racing. Going home and facing my mom seemed impossible. I needed a moment to breathe, to figure out what to do with all of this. Part of me wanted to shout the truth to everyone, climb up on the altar and expose every lie my father had told to the congregation. He deserved that. He deserved to be seen for the fraud he was. But what about my mom? That doubt consumed me until I couldn't bear it anymore. When I finally got home, I found my mom sitting on the porch. Her gaze was too calm, which only made me more nervous. I sat beside her, feeling a lump in my throat. I waited for her to ask what was wrong, but she said nothing. She just kept looking at the horizon, her hands folded in her lap. After a long silence, I was the one who broke the ice. "You knew, didn't you?" She closed her eyes for a second. She didn't need to answer. I saw the answer on her face. My world collapsed for the second time. My mom knew. How long had she known? Forever? Since before I was born? "What could I have done, Lily?" she said in her quiet voice. "He's a powerful man. The town loves him. And I'm nothing without him." It was the saddest thing I'd ever heard. My mom, the woman who raised me, who taught me about strength and dignity, felt trapped by a man who was blatantly betraying her. "That's not true. You don't need him." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. A smile from someone who had already made peace with her own prison. I wish it were that simple. And in that moment, I knew. She would never leave my father. No matter what I said, no matter what he did. She would live this lie until the end. But I didn't have to. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't say where I was going, because I didn't know myself. I just knew I couldn't stay anymore. I left a note for my mom, telling her I loved her, but that I couldn't be part of a life built on lies. For my father, I left nothing. I got in the car and drove off without looking back. As I drove away from that town, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't have a set destination. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best thing that ever happened to me.